The ring. It was meant for your mother. She dropped the tray. She crossed the ballroom in 4 strides. She stepped directly between Raymond Vescari's outstretched hand and Evelyn Hawthorne's heart and felt the needle pierce her own skin instead. Raymond Vescari was smiling. The operations chief of the most powerful crime family in Chicago had spent 2 years planning this moment. One touch, one heartbeat. The old woman dies, the empire falls. And nobody would ever suspect the gold ring on a smiling man's finger. He had one fatal miscalculation. He forgot to watch the maid. And that overlooked, invisible woman in a household apron just changed everything. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to this channel and follow Elena's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Elena Brooks had learned something in 24 years of living that most people never figure out until it is too late. She had learned that the most dangerous thing in any room is not the person making the most noise. It is the one standing so still and so quiet that everyone else forgets they are there at all. She had been invisible for most of her life. Invisible at school, where teachers passed over her because she never raised her hand, not because she did not know the answers, but because she had already learned that drawing attention to yourself was a kind of risk she could not afford. Invisible at home, after her mother left, and her father started making the kinds of choices that slowly pull a family apart one bad decision at a time. And invisible here, at the Hawthorne estate, where she had spent nearly 3 years carrying trays, laundering linens, polishing silverware, and walking through rooms full of powerful people who looked through her like she was part of the furniture. She told herself it was fine. She told herself it was actually useful. You see things when people forget you are there. You hear things. You notice things that the people who are busy being noticed never catch. And on the night of Evelyn Hawthorne's birthday gala, Elena noticed something that changed the course of everything for herself, for the Hawthorne family, and for a man who had spent his entire adult life believing that power meant you never had to be surprised by anything. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand what Elena saw that night, you have to understand what kind of woman she was before that moment, not the woman she became after. The woman she was when nobody was watching. The woman she was when nobody cared. Elena's mornings at the Hawthorne estate started at 5:30. Not because her contract required it, but because that was the only time the kitchen was quiet enough that she could think. She would make herself a small cup of coffee, the cheap kind she brought from home in a reusable container, because she was not about to help herself to the estate's imported single-origin roast, and she would sit at the corner of the long prep table for exactly 12 minutes before the rest of the staff arrived, and the day became noisy. On those mornings, she would sometimes write letters to her younger sister, Maya, who was 2 years into a nursing program at a state college 40 miles south of Chicago. The letters were never long. They were just enough to remind Maya that someone was thinking about her. Someone was keeping track of how hard she was working. Someone believed that when Maya graduated and got her first real job and started building her own life, it was going to mean something. Maya did not know the full extent of what Elena had given up to keep that tuition money flowing. She did not know about the overtime Elena never got paid for, because the former household supervisor, a man named Garrett, with small eyes, and a habit of standing just slightly too close when he gave instructions, had a system for disappearing those hours off the official timesheets. She did not know that Elena had stopped going to the dentist, stopped buying new shoes, and had been sleeping on a mattress with a broken spring for 2 years because replacing it felt like a luxury she had not earned yet. She knew about the debt their father had left behind. That part, Elena could not hide entirely because the collection notices sometimes came to Maya's college address by mistake, and Maya would call in a panic, and Elena would have to talk her down. She told Maya it was being handled. She told her not to worry. What she did not tell Maya was that the people handling the collection were connected to the same organization that employed her. That the man named Adrian Hawthorne, who owned the estate where Elena changed the bed sheets and scrubbed the baseboards, was also, in some indirect and carefully structured way, the man whose organization had been quietly absorbing that debt and using it to keep Elena exactly where she was. Not because Adrian had personally ordered it, but because systems like that do not need a specific order. They just run. They run on their own weight, the way a river runs downhill, because that is the direction everything naturally flows when nobody steps in to change it. Elena had figured this out in pieces, over time, the way you figure out most uncomfortable truths, not all at once, but in small installments that you add up slowly, late at night, when you are too tired to pretend anymore. She had not decided what to do about it yet. That was the honest answer. She was still in the calculating stage, still measuring the distance between where she was and where she needed to be to have enough ground under her feet to push back without getting knocked over. And then the gala happened, and all of her careful calculating became suddenly irrelevant, because some situations do not give you time to finish your math. The preparations for Evelyn Hawthorne's birthday gala had been running for 2 weeks before the night itself. Elena had been part of every stage of it, though of course nobody had consulted her about any of the decisions. Her job was to execute, not to advise. She knew that. She was fine with that. What she was not fine with was the particular chaos that descended on the estate in the 48 hours before the event, when outside vendors and caterers and florists and technical staff were moving through spaces that were usually restricted, and the regular security protocols were being bent and stretched, and occasionally just quietly set aside because there were too many people to check and too many deliveries to track, and the gala had to look perfect, and looking perfect required speed, and speed required corners to be cut. Elena noticed the corners being cut. She noticed them the way she noticed everything, quietly, without making a show of it, filing the information away without being entirely sure yet why it mattered. She noticed that 2 of the main entrance scanners, the ones usually used to check guests and their belongings before they were admitted to the estate, had been powered down for a period of approximately 30 minutes. During the vendor setup on the afternoon of the gala, she heard 2 security employees talking about it in the hallway outside the linen closet. They were not being secretive about it. They were complaining, actually, because it was not their decision and they had not been informed ahead of time, and it made their jobs harder. 30 minutes, one of them said, his voice flat with the particular exhaustion of a man who had lodged this complaint before and expected it to go nowhere. 30 minutes. Nobody scanned, nobody logged. Anything could have walked through that door. Relax, the other one said. It's a birthday party. Half these people donate to children's hospitals. Nobody's bringing a weapon to a birthday party. Elena had filed that away. 30 minutes. Unscanned. And she had gone back to folding napkins. The guests started arriving at 7 in the evening. Elena was stationed in the main ballroom, circling with a tray of champagne flutes, which meant she was present for every entrance, every greeting, every moment when the assembled wealth and power of Chicago's overlapping legitimate and not entirely legitimate worlds came together and tried to behave like they all belonged in the same room. She had done this before. She knew how to hold a tray level, how to move without drawing attention, how to anticipate when a guest was about to reach for a glass and be there before they had to look for her. She knew how to be useful and absent at the same time, which was a specific and undervalued skill. She was also, beneath all of that practiced efficiency, watching. She watched because she could not help it. 3 years of paying close attention to everything in every room had made observation automatic. It was not paranoia. It was pattern recognition. It was knowing what normal looked like well enough to feel it when something was not. Raymond Vescari arrived at 7:45 with a small group of associates and a smile that had been calibrated to a precise and very specific frequency, warm enough to be read as friendly, cool enough to signal that the warmth was entirely on his terms. Elena had seen him at the estate before, twice, and she did not like him. She was not in a position where her likes and dislikes about the guests were relevant information, so she kept that assessment filed away with everything else. But she watched him. She watched him cross the room. She watched him greet other guests with the handshake that lingered a half-second too long, the one that was technically a greeting, but also technically a measurement. She watched him accept a glass of champagne from another server's tray and carry it through the room without drinking it. And she watched his hands. She watched his hands because there was something about the way he held them. People who are carrying something they are worried about hold their hands differently. It is subtle. It is the kind of thing you would never notice if you were focused on someone's face, the way most people are, because faces are where we expect the truth to be. But hands tell a different story. And Elena had spent 3 years learning to read the stories that bodies tell when they think nobody is paying attention. Raymond Vescari's right hand kept drifting to his left, touching a specific point on his ring finger, then pulling back. Not adjusting the ring, he was not twisting it or pushing it higher. Just touching, checking, making sure. Elena had seen people do that with wedding rings when they were anxious. She had seen people do it with medical alert bracelets. She had seen people do it with jewelry they were afraid of losing. But Raymond did not seem like a man who was afraid of losing anything. He seemed like a man who was very precisely aware of where something was and whether it was ready. The ring itself was gold, heavy. The crest on top was elaborate and ornate design that she could not make out clearly from across the room, but that caught the light in a way that drew her eye back to it every time she passed. She was not certain yet. She was not certain of anything. But her certainty had never been the thing that kept her alive. Her instincts had. Evelyn Hawthorne came downstairs at 8 o'clock, and the room shifted around her the way rooms shift around people who carry real authority. Not the performance of authority, not the costume of it, but the actual thing, the kind that comes from having navigated 67 years of a complicated life and arrived on the other side of most of it with your integrity more or less intact. Evelyn was small. She had the slightly diminished quality of a person whose body was working hard to compensate for a damaged heart. And if you knew what to look for, you could see it the careful way she descended the stairs, the slight pause at the landing, the way her daughter-in-law Marcia positioned herself 2 steps behind without being asked. But her eyes were clear and sharp and lit with something that Elena had always read as genuine warmth, which was rarer in this house than the imported champagne. Evelyn had noticed Elena 18 months ago, which was remarkable, because most of the family and guests had been not noticing her for 3 years and showed no signs of stopping. She had been carrying a tea tray through the east corridor when Evelyn had stopped her and asked her name. Not what she was bringing, not where she was going. Her name, Elena Brooks, Elena had said, slightly caught off guard. Beautiful name, Evelyn had said. Irish origin, I believe, though some scholars debate it. Do you have family in the area, Elena? And Elena had told her about Maya, just briefly, just a sentence or two. And Evelyn had said, a nursing student. Good. The world needs more of those. And then she had gone on her way, and Elena had stood there for a moment feeling something she could not immediately name until she recognized it as the mildly disorienting experience of having been treated like a person by someone who did not have to. Since then, Evelyn had asked about Maya by name every time she and Elena crossed paths. It was a small thing. It was also the only small thing in this entire house that Elena had not had to earn or perform for or defend. So when Raymond Vescari began making his way across the ballroom toward Evelyn, and when Elena's eyes went to his hands again and saw the almost imperceptible shift beneath the crest of that gold ring, a tiny movement, mechanical, precise, like a small door opening, she did not stop to finish her calculation. She dropped her tray. The sound of it, hitting the marble floor, cracked through the ballroom like a starting gun, and every head turned, and in the half-second of collective distraction she had bought herself, Elena crossed the floor in 4 strides and stepped directly between Raymond Vescari and Evelyn Hawthorne. She stepped into his extended hand. She felt the needle before she understood what it was. A point of sharp cold at the side of her wrist, there, and gone so fast that it could have been anything. A fingernail, a piece of the ring's casing. She did not know yet that it had broken her skin. She did not know yet what was on it. What she knew, immediately and with absolute certainty, was that Raymond Vescari's expression changed in a way that no amount of careful social calibration could fully control. The smile stayed, the eyes did not. For one fraction of a second, she saw it a flash of pure, cold calculation, recalibrating, processing, adjusting, and then he laughed. Soft, easy, reaching past her to take her arm as though steadying her. Careful, he said pleasantly. These floors are treacherous. His grip on her arm was firm, not helping firm, containing firm. The kind of grip that says stay exactly where you are and do not make this worse. Elena did not make a scene. She did not scream. She had spent 24 years learning how to be still in situations where stillness was the only available form of power, and she deployed that skill now, turning her face toward the room with the practiced neutrality of someone who had simply made a clumsy mistake. But she was already cataloging what she felt, the warmth spreading from her wrist, the slight heaviness beginning at the back of her knees. The way the lights in the room seemed, just slightly, to take a fraction of a second longer to process. She had maybe 3 minutes, she thought, maybe less. She did not know what was happening to her body, but her body was telling her that the window was closing. She looked for Adrian. Adrian Hawthorne was standing at the far end of the ballroom. In a conversation, he was not particularly present. For she could tell that even from across the room, the way you can tell when someone's attention is on the surface of an interaction rather than inside it. He was nodding at appropriate intervals, holding a glass of water he had not touched, scanning the room with the peripheral efficiency of someone who had been trained from childhood to never stop watching. Their eyes met. She did not know exactly what her face communicated in that moment. She was not entirely in control of it anymore. The thing in her bloodstream was beginning to work, and her body was responding in ways she could not fully override. But it was enough. Adrian Hawthorne covered the length of the ballroom in a time that suggested he had not walked, but simply decided to be somewhere else and arrived there. He was beside her before Raymond had finished his pleasantry, and his hand was on her shoulder, not romantic, not possessive, but steady in the way of something that is decided is not moving. Elena, his voice was low. What happened? Raymond released her arm, smoothly, naturally, as though he had simply been helping and was now stepping aside. Your staff member had a fall, Raymond said. I was just making sure she... I need a moment, Elena said. She said it directly to Adrian, which was the most forwardly she had ever spoken to him in 3 years, and she saw the micro shift in his expression, the register of something unexpected. Privately. Right now, she felt his hesitation last exactly half a second. Then he nodded once and turned toward Raymond with the kind of polite dismissal that wealthy, powerful men have perfected, the one that ends a conversation without technically ending it, leaving the other person no graceful option but to conclude that the interaction is over. He walked her to the edge of the room. She turned toward him, and she said the words before the room tilted any further. The ring. Her voice was steadier than she felt. It was meant for your mother. She saw his face change completely. Not the way people's faces change in movies dramatically, obviously. The way people's faces change in real life, when something hits them at the very center of everything they care about, quietly, deeply, like watching a foundation crack. What happened to you? He said. It was not a question. Something from the ring. A needle, I think. She paused. The floor felt less reliable than it had 30 seconds ago. I need you to not let Raymond Vescari leave this building. Adrian was already talking to someone, not shouting, not panicking, just issuing a sequence of very specific instructions into a communications device she had not seen him produce, in a tone of voice that made it clear these were not requests. The ballroom doors, the side exits, the car entrance, all of it, sealed. Elena felt her knees make a decision she had not authorized, and she would have gone to the floor except that Adrian was already there, his arm around her before she had completed the motion. And she heard him say something sharp, and close her name, she thought, or possibly a command to someone nearby. And then the ballroom was tilting at an angle that no ballroom should tilt at, and she found herself thinking with the strange, clear precision of a mind that has started to go offline that she really hoped Maya had finished her biochemistry paper. And then everything went dark. She was not entirely unconscious. That was the thing she would remember later, when she was sitting upright in a hospital bed and trying to reconstruct the sequence of events from the pieces she had retained. She had not fully lost consciousness. She had been present in the way that a radio station is present when the signal is very weak, intermittent, cutting in and out, moments of clarity between long stretches of interference. She remembered the marble floor not reaching her, which meant someone had caught her. She knew it was Adrian before she opened her eyes, or tried to, because she could hear him, still issuing instructions, his voice close and controlled and not quite as steady as he probably wanted it to be. She remembered the sound of the room being evacuated, not a panicked evacuation, a directed one, the kind that people who have run security operations are trained to execute, where the guests are guided rather than herded, and the whole thing looks less like an emergency than a change of plans. She remembered Evelyn's voice saying her name just once, Elena, and the sound of it was the most frightened sound she had ever heard from a person who was trying not to sound frightened. She wanted to tell Evelyn that she was fine. She could not find the words. She tried. What came out was approximately "I'm," and then the signal cut out again. The medical room at the Hawthorne estate had been installed 3 years ago when Evelyn's heart condition was first diagnosed. It was equipped more extensively than most people's assumption of a home medical room, because Adrian Hawthorne was not a man who made assumptions about what sufficient preparation looked like. There was monitoring equipment, emergency medications, a defibrillator, and a standing arrangement with a private physician who could be on site within 20 minutes. The physician arrived in 18. Elena knew this later. At the time, she was mostly aware of lights, a blood pressure cuff, and the extremely unpleasant sensation of her body trying very hard to do something it was being chemically prevented from doing properly. She heard the physician say the words cardiac toxin and then a sequence of other words that were too precise and too fast for her to track in her current state. She heard Adrian's voice asking a question. She heard the physician's answer. She heard Adrian say something quiet and very flat that she did not catch. And she heard the quality of the silence that followed it, which was the quality of silence that happens when people in a room all simultaneously decide not to speak. She wanted to ask whether Evelyn was all right. She needed to know that. Of everything that was currently happening to her, that was the one piece of information she could not be without. She found a fragment of voice. "Evelyn," she said, or something close to it, and she felt a hand cover hers. A specific hand, small, cool, with the particular slightly papery quality of skin that belongs to a person in their late 60s. And she heard Evelyn Hawthorne say, close and clear and completely steady, "I am right here, my dear. And so are you. I am going to need you to be." Elena breathed. She breathed because Evelyn told her to, and because Evelyn was there, and because those two things together were enough to give her something to hold on to while the rest of it sorted itself out. The paramedics arrived and took over, and the decision was made quickly to transport Elena to a secure hospital in Chicago, where there were toxicology specialists and equipment that the estate's medical room could not replicate. The physician wanted to move fast. The toxin in her system was identified as rare and serious, not immediately fatal in the dose she had received, but serious enough that intervention needed to be precise and prompt. Adrian accompanied the ambulance. Nobody asked him to. Nobody suggested it. He simply got in. There was a moment as the doors were closing when one of his associates, a man named Morris, who had been with the Hawthorne organization for 11 years and who had been managing the ballroom's official aftermath, said, through the closing door, "Sir, there are things here that require your..." "Handle them," Adrian said. The door closed. Elena was not fully conscious for this, but she heard it. She filed it away in the half-functional archive of her mind that was still collecting and storing information even while the rest of her was struggling. The ambulance moved. She felt the motion. She thought about Maya. She thought about the letter she had been meaning to send, the one she had started 3 times and not finished, the one that was supposed to say some version of, "I am proud of you, and keep going, and you are going to be extraordinary. And I know you are going to be all right, even when things are hard, because you are harder than the hard things." She had not sent it yet. She thought she should probably make sure to send it. Elena Brooks was unconscious for 3 days. The toxin she had been exposed to through Raymond Vescari's ring was a rare cardiac compound engineered, the toxicology team told Adrian, not naturally occurring. It had been designed to induce cardiac arrest in a person with a pre-existing heart condition. A person like Evelyn Hawthorne, whose weakened heart would not have survived it. In Elena, whose heart was healthy and 24 years old, the same dose had been serious but survivable, assuming rapid intervention and precise treatment. The intervention had been rapid. The treatment had been precise. The toxicology team at the hospital had good funding and better training, and they had seen unusual compounds before because the hospital had a standing relationship with federal investigative agencies, which was another detail that would become relevant very soon. Elena was monitored continuously. Adrian visited each day. He did not stay long each time. He had a great deal to manage from the situation at the estate, and the hospital staff were professionally firm about what was and was not appropriate visiting behavior. But he came. Every day. He sat in the chair beside her bed for however long was allowed, and he was still there when the time was up, and the nurses had to remind him twice on the second day and once on the third. Nobody told him to do this. He had simply decided to, the way he had decided to get in the ambulance. On the 4th morning, Elena opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was hospital ceiling. The second thing she saw was morning light through a window. The third thing she saw was Evelyn Hawthorne sitting in the chair to her left, reading from a paperback novel with her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. Elena said, "You're here." Evelyn looked up. She set down the book. She took off the reading glasses and held them in her hand and looked at Elena with an expression that was entirely unguarded, not the careful, measured expression of a woman who had spent decades managing her reactions in rooms full of people who were watching for weakness. Just a face. Just a person who had been frightened for 4 days and was now, very cautiously, beginning to be relieved. "Of course I'm here," Evelyn said. "Where else would I be? Is Adrian? He'll be here at 9. He arrives at 9 every morning. It is currently 8:43. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "He's been very punctual." Elena considered this. Her throat was dry, and her whole body had the specific weighted quality of a person who has been horizontal for too long. And she was wearing a hospital gown that was comfortable in the way that all hospital gowns are not comfortable, and she needed about 17 things that were not immediately available. But she was here, she was thinking. The signal was back. Is Raymond Vescari in custody? She asked. Evelyn's expression shifted just slightly, appreciation perhaps for the particular ordering of Elena's priorities. Yes, she said. He was detained at the estate on the night of the gala and has been held since. Adrian's people have been very thorough. In the ring? In the possession of federal investigators, I'm told. Along with Mr. Vescari as of yesterday morning. Elena let out a breath that felt like it had been held for 4 days. Good, she said. She was quiet for a moment. The machines beside her made their small, steady sounds. Outside, the city was doing what the city does at 8:43 in the morning on a weekday in Chicago, which is to say it was moving and loud and entirely indifferent to the particular drama being conducted in this particular room. How did you know? Evelyn asked. She asked it gently, the way you ask a question when you already understand that the answer is going to be something important. Elena thought about how to explain it. She thought about the 30-minute scanner shutdown she had heard about in the hallway. She thought about Raymond's hands and the specific quality of his attention on his ring and the tiny mechanical movement she had seen beneath its crest. She thought about 24 years of being overlooked by people who assumed that invisible meant unaware. I was watching, she said finally. I'm always watching. Nobody ever seems to expect that. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, no, I suppose. The door opened at 9 o'clock exactly. Adrian Hawthorne walked in and stopped when he saw Elena's open eyes, and the look on his face was the kind of unguarded human thing that powerful men spend most of their lives very successfully preventing anyone from seeing. You're awake, he said. It came out without any of the authority that usually lived in his voice. I'm awake, Elena agreed. He crossed the room and stood beside the bed and said nothing for a moment, which was notable, because in Elena's experience, Adrian Hawthorne always had something to say. Your sister knows you're here, he said finally. We told her the first day. She wanted to come immediately. I had someone drive her up. She's been here twice. She went back to school this morning because you would have wanted her to. Elena felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. Thank you, she said. He nodded, looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. I have some things I need to tell you, he said. About what I found out while you were. He stopped. While you were here. Okay, Elena said. Some of it is about how you were being treated. In my house. His voice was careful, measured. But underneath the measure, something that she would not have expected from this man, something that sounded almost like it was a shame. I didn't know. I want to tell you that, and I also want to tell you that me not knowing is not an excuse, and I know that, and I am not using it as one. Elena looked at him. She was 24 years old, and she had been running a debt that was not hers, working unpaid hours for a supervisor who enjoyed having that power over her, and living inside a system that had been designed not by any single evil decision, but by the accumulated weight of 1,000 comfortable ones, to make sure that people in her position stayed in their position. And here was the man at the top of that system telling her he did not know. She believed him. That was the thing she had not expected. She looked at his face and she believed him, and then she believed something more complicated and more interesting, that it actually mattered to him, that this was not a managed response, that he was, at this moment, a person who had just learned something about himself and was having the fairly adult experience of deciding what to do with that information. She said, I believe you didn't know. And you're right that it's not an excuse. He held her greed. It's not. So what are you going to do about it? And for the first time since she had woken up, something shifted in the room, something that had been heavy and unresolved. Began very cautiously to move in a direction that felt like the future. I already started, he said, but I'd like to tell you about it, if you're willing to listen. Elena glanced at Evelyn, who had returned to her paperback with the very deliberate quality of a woman who was absolutely listening to every word of this conversation and was simply too wise to let that be known. Elena turned back to Adrian. I'm listening, she said. Adrian Hawthorne was not a man who explained himself. That was the first thing anyone who had worked with him for more than a week figured out. He made decisions. He communicated those decisions. He expected them to be implemented. The space between making the decision and communicating it, the part where most people offered context, reasons, the internal logic that had driven them from point A to point B, that space for Adrian simply did not exist. It had never needed to. So when he sat down in the chair beside Elena's hospital bed and said, I want to tell you what I found, and then actually told her, in sequence with detail, with the particular quality of a person who was constructing a record, rather than managing an impression, Elena understood, without being told, that this was not a normal thing for him, that something had shifted, that she was being offered something that this man did not offer easily or often. She listened. He had started the audit within 12 hours of her being admitted to the hospital. Not an internal review, he had been clear about that distinction. And she noticed that he was clear about it, which told her something. An outside firm. Forensic accountants with no prior relationship to the Hawthorne organization, brought in under a legal arrangement that required them to report findings directly and independently. He had wanted no ability to filter what they found before it became a record. "What made you do it that way?" Elena asked. Adrian looked at her for a moment. "Because if I filtered it, I would already be deciding what I deserved to know. And I had just spent 4 days realizing that I had been filtering things for a long time without calling it that." Elena said nothing. She let that sit. He told her about Garrett first, the household supervisor, the overtime records. The system Garrett had built over several years for quietly absorbing those hours off the official timesheets and redirecting a portion of the recovered wages into a personal account. It had been running for longer than Elena had worked there. She was not the only employee it had affected. There were 6 others currently on staff, and the accountants believed there had been at least a dozen more over the years who had simply left without ever knowing they were owed money. Elena felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite vindication. It was more complicated than either of those. It was the specific sensation of having your own lived experience confirmed by external evidence, of having the thing you knew be true proven to be true, after years of carrying it alone. "Garrett," she said, "is no longer employed by me," Adrian said, "as of 2 days ago." "Where is he?" "He is aware that full cooperation with the restitution process is the most favorable available outcome for him at this point." Adrian's voice was even precise. "He is cooperating." Elena absorbed this. "Then the debt, my father's debt." Adrian's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did a slight tightening, the look of a person who has arrived at the part of a conversation they have been moving toward and is not finding it comfortable now that they are here. The collection arrangement connected to that debt was operating through a subsidiary that I had not reviewed personally in over 2 years. The original lender, the man your father borrowed from, disappeared 18 months ago, under circumstances that remain under investigation by federal authorities. He paused. The debt should have been closed when he disappeared. Instead, collection continued. "Through my organization, against a woman working in my house." He stopped. Elena waited. "That should not have happened," he said. "It will not continue. The debt is canceled. Fully. With documentation that makes the cancellation legally binding and cannot be reversed or reinterpreted by anyone in my organization at any future point." Elena held his gaze for a long moment. She was calculating something, not math. Exactly. But the specific internal accounting that people who have been in precarious situations do automatically, where you measure what you are being offered against what it would cost you to accept it. Whether the gift comes with a string, whether the cancellation is genuine, or whether it is just a different form of the same arrangement with a different name on the outside. She looked at his face. She looked at Evelyn, who had still not turned a page in that paperback. She looked back at Adrian. "I want you reviewed by an attorney who has no relationship with your organization. Not one you recommend, one I choose." "Yes," he said without hesitation. "And I want the restitution for the overtime, for me and the other employees, calculated by the outside accountants, not anyone internal, and distributed directly. Already initiated. And Maya's education fund." He shook his head slightly. "That is separate. That is not tied to any of this. It is not restitution." He stopped. Seemed to search briefly for a word that was not one he used often. "It is what I should have done a long time ago. For anyone in my household whose family was trying to move forward." Elena looked at him for a long time. Then she said carefully and clearly, because she needed him to hear this and she needed to mean it when she said it, "Saving your mother doesn't mean you own my life." The room was quiet. Evelyn's paperback did not move. Adrian did not look away. He did not flinch. He absorbed it, the full weight of what she had said, and she watched him do it, watched him let it land instead of deflecting it. "I know," he said, "I know that. And I am not trying to. Every decision about your future is yours. I want that to be something I actually demonstrate, not just something I say right now." Elena gave him a single slow nod, not forgiveness, not trust. Something more like the preliminary acknowledgement that both of those things might, under certain conditions and over sufficient time, become possible. "All right," she said. "What else did you find?" And Adrian Hawthorne, who did not explain himself, explained himself. He talked for 40 minutes. Evelyn eventually set down the paperback without pretending anymore, and the three of them sat in that hospital room while the city moved outside the window. And Adrian laid out what the previous 4 days had shown him about the organization he had inherited, and the distance between what he believed it was and what it actually turned out to be when someone looked without deciding in advance what they would find. There were labor violations beyond the overtime theft. There were collection practices in 3 subsidiary operations that were not legal. There were contracts with employees that had been structured specifically to prevent those employees from having recourse. And there was a supervisor network, a system of garrets, essentially, distributed across multiple properties and businesses that had been operating on the same basic model: take from the people at the bottom, because the people at the bottom cannot afford to fight back. Elena listened to all of it. She asked questions, specific questions, not the questions of someone who was overwhelmed, but the questions of someone who had been living inside a small piece of this system for 3 years and was now seeing the larger structure for the first time and wanted to understand its geometry. At one point, she asked, "Did you know any of this was happening?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not in the way you mean. I did not approve these practices. I did not design them." Another pause. "But I set conditions that made them possible. I rewarded results without examining methods. I gave authority to people without supervising how they used it. I was comfortable with not looking." He met her eyes. "That is a form of knowing. I am not going to pretend it isn't." Elena felt something shift in her assessment of him. Not dramatically. Not the kind of shift that resolves things, but the kind of shift that opens a door slightly, lets a little light in, and makes you aware of a space that you did not know was there before. She thought about what she had said to him when she first woke up. "Saving your mother doesn't mean you own my life." She had meant it as a boundary, a fence, a clear marking of territory. But sitting here now, listening to this man do the thing that most people in his position would never do, not because they could not, but because they had spent so long being unchallenged that the muscle for it had simply atrophied, she understood that the fence was still necessary, and also that there might be more to this particular geography than she had initially mapped. She filed that away. She was good at filing things away. "There is one more thing," she said. He looked at her. Raymond Vescari could not have gotten into that ballroom with that ring without help from inside. She watched his face very carefully. The scanner shut down. The camera blind spots, the timing. None of that was an accident. Someone inside your organization helped him. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before. This one had weight. The particular weight of a fact that a person has been circling and not quite landing on, and then someone else lands on it for them and the ground shifts. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. Evelyn met his gaze and said very quietly, "She's right." "I know," Adrian said, and something in his voice had changed, had gone colder and quieter and more focused, in the way that water goes when it freezes. "I know she's right." He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room. For approximately 10 seconds she counted, because she was still Elena, and she still counted things, and then he turned around. "Do you remember anything else from the gala?" he asked. "Anything specific? Anything that might tell us who?" And this was the moment Elena had been waiting for, without knowing she had been waiting for it, since she had first started to put the pieces together from her hospital bed during the intermittent hours of clarity between medication cycles. Because she did remember something. She had been turning it over in her mind for 2 days, examining it from different angles, making sure she was certain before she said it out loud. She was certain. "I do." Adrian waited. 2 days before the gala, she said, "I was near the service entrance when the outside vendors were still coming and going. A man was standing at the corner of the entrance corridor. He was talking to one of the security officers, not a full conversation, just a few words, the kind that looks like small talk but is actually something else." She paused. "He told the officer to disable the camera covering the east service corridor for exactly 3 minutes. I remember the words exactly. Not for a while. Not for a few minutes. Exactly 3 minutes. That's a specific number. A specific instruction." Adrian was very still. "I also remember," Elena continued, "that he had a lighter. He used it while he was standing there, old habit probably, the kind of nervous thing people do. Silver, unusual, a falcon engraved on the side." She held Adrian's gaze. "I don't know many of the people in your organization by name, but I have worked in your house for 3 years. I have seen that lighter before. On the desk in the East Operations office. On the man who uses that office." The color in Adrian's face did not drain exactly, because he was the kind of man who had trained himself not to show that. But something behind his eyes went very still and very flat, and his jaw set in a way that she had never seen on his face before. "Graham Hale," Evelyn said softly. Not a question. She said it the way you say the name of something you have been afraid of and have just finally seen clearly. Adrian did not answer for a moment. When he did, his voice was so controlled it was almost toneless. "Are you certain?" Elena did not look away. "I'm certain about the lighter. I'm certain about what I heard. And I'm certain that the man I saw was the same man I have seen in the East Operations office 4 times in the past 18 months. Adrian turned to Evelyn. Evelyn was looking back at him with the expression of a woman who has seen a great deal in 67 years and is now seeing something she had hoped she would never have to see. "Graham has been with our family for 30 years, she said, quietly, with the specific gentleness of someone delivering a fact that is going to hurt regardless of how gently it is delivered. "I know," Adrian said. "Your father trusted him completely." "I know that too." Evelyn's hands folded in her lap. "That is what makes it." She stopped. Chose not to finish that sentence. Started a different one. "What are you going to do?" And this was the question. This was the question that everything else had been building toward in the 48 hours since Elena had said Raymond Vescari's ring was meant for your mother, in the 4 days since the ambulance, in the audit and the canceled debt, in the 40 minutes of explanation, and all of it. This was the question underneath every other question. "What are you going to do?" Adrian looked at Elena. She had not been asked. She was a 24-year-old woman in a hospital bed who had been poisoned at his family's party, and he had not asked her what to do next. And yet he was looking at her in the way that people look at someone when they are aware, suddenly and uncomfortably, that this particular person has a perspective that matters. Elena said, "Whatever you do next, be careful. If Graham Hale has been inside your organization for 30 years and has now made a move this serious, he did not do it impulsively. He did it because he believes he has options that you don't know about yet. He is going to be watching what happens next very closely." Adrian absorbed this. "He doesn't know that you identified him. He knows I was conscious when Raymond used the ring. He doesn't know what I saw before that. He knows I said something to you before I collapsed. He doesn't know what." Elena paused. "He thinks I'm an overlooked maid who got in the way by accident. He thinks the damage is limited." She watched that land. "Then let him keep thinking that," Adrian said slowly. "For now," Elena agreed. "But not for long. He is going to move again. He has to. The first attempt failed, which means the clock is running." Adrian nodded, once. The way he nodded when he was converting information into decision. "I need to get back to the estate." He moved toward the door. Then he stopped, turned back, looked at Elena with the specific expression of someone who has something to say and is aware that they do not have the right vocabulary for it yet. He said, "You saved my mother's life. You did it without being asked and without knowing what it would cost you. And then the first thing you asked when you woke up was whether she was all right." He stopped. "I don't know how to adequately." "You don't have to," Elena said, not unkindly. "Just do what you said you were going to do." He held her gaze for a moment. "I will left." The door closed. The room was quiet. Evelyn waited approximately 4 seconds, which was the appropriate amount of time to wait before speaking. "He is going to make a great many mistakes," Evelyn said, "before he gets this right." "I know," Elena said. "So will you." Elena looked at her. "I know that too." Evelyn picked up her paperback. Then she set it back down and looked at Elena over the top of where her reading glasses would have been. "For what it is worth, my dear, the fact that you told him the truth about the lighter and what you saw, instead of keeping it to leverage later, that is not a small thing. Most people in your situation would have kept it, would have considered it a form of insurance." Elena thought about this. It was not a wrong observation. She had thought about keeping it. She had weighed it. She had made a choice, and the choice had been deliberate, and she was not entirely certain yet whether it had been the right one. She was still in the part of the story where you could not see far enough ahead to know for sure. "If I kept it," she said, "I'd be running the same system he was running, just with different people on the inside." Evelyn smiled. It was the kind of smile that lives in the eyes more than the mouth. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly right." She picked up the paperback again. This time she actually read it. Elena lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling and thought about Graham Hale and silver lighters and the specific arithmetic of a betrayal that had been 30 years in the construction and a man who had just found out that the maid he had never noticed had been paying very close attention after all. Across the city, back at the Hawthorne estate, Graham Hale was sitting in the East Operations office, the one with the silver lighter on the desk, reviewing a security report about the gala. He was reading it carefully. He was noting what was in it and what was not. He was running calculations of his own. He had no way of knowing that the most significant threat to everything he had planned was currently lying in a hospital bed 40 minutes away, drinking terrible hospital coffee and filing away everything she had figured out. He had never known. He had been in this building with her for months, and he had never known, because he had made the same mistake everyone else had made. He had looked at Elena Brooks and seen a maid. He had not seen someone who was always watching. That mistake was about to cost him everything. But he would not understand that for another 72 hours. And in those 72 hours, Elena would go home, recover, return to the estate on her own terms, and put together the last piece of the puzzle, the piece that would make it impossible for Graham Hale to disappear quietly into a story where Raymond Vescari had acted alone. She was not going to let him have that story. She had a better one. Elena was discharged from the hospital on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the gala. Maya had taken 2 days off from school to be there, which Elena had tried to argue against and failed, because Maya had inherited the same immovable quality that Elena had, just deployed with considerably more open emotion and a willingness to cry in public that Elena had never quite managed. They sat together in the discharge waiting room while the paperwork processed, Maya's hand wrapped around Elena's, and for a long time neither of them said anything meaningful. They talked about small things. Maya's biochemistry paper, the fact that the hospital cafeteria had surprisingly good pie, the specific injustice of fluorescent lighting at 9 in the morning. And then Maya said quietly, without looking at her, "You could have died." Elena did not say "you're overreacting" or "it wasn't that serious," or any of the other things she might have said 6 months ago when her primary mode of managing her sister was protective minimization. She said, "Yes, I could have." Maya's hand tightened. "Promise me something." "Depends what it is. Stop pretending you're invisible." Maya looked at her then, and her eyes were clear and direct in the way they always were when she was being completely serious, which was a look Elena had been on the receiving end of since Maya was 11 years old, and had more moral clarity than most adults Elena knew. "You have been walking through your whole life, acting like you don't take up space, like you don't matter enough to protect yourself. And I know why you did it. I know what it cost you, all of it, and I am never going to stop being grateful. But Elena, you stepped in front of a poisoned ring." "I stepped in front of a poisoned ring because someone else was about to be killed." "I know, that's who you are. I'm not asking you to change that." Maya paused. "I'm asking you to also be someone who knows that her own life has the same value as the one she's protecting." Elena was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a cart with a squeaky wheel went past. "I'm working on it," Elena said finally, and she meant it. Maya leaned her head against Elena's shoulder, and Elena leaned back, and they sat like that until the paperwork was ready. The drive back was quiet. Elena watched the city move past the window and thought about what she knew and what she still needed to figure out. And she thought about Graham Hale's silver lighter, and she thought about the 72 hours she had given herself in the hospital to construct the last piece of the picture before she brought it fully to Adrian. She was almost there, not quite. There was one gap, one piece of the geometry she had not yet locked into place. She knew who. She was still building the complete architecture of how and why and what Graham had been planning to do after the first move succeeded. Because the poisoned ring had been a first move. It was elegant, and it was designed to look like a natural death, and it was designed to be the beginning of something, not the end. Evelyn Hawthorne dying of apparent cardiac arrest at her own birthday party, convenient, deniable, devastating to Adrian's authority at a moment when he was already making enemies by pushing toward legitimacy. That kind of move does not stand alone. That kind of move is the first domino in a sequence, and Elena needed to understand the rest of the sequence before Graham realized she was building the case against him. She had 9 days since the gala. She calculated he would give himself approximately 2 weeks before making his next move. The clock was running. She went home, slept for 11 hours, and went back to work the next morning. Nobody had told her to. Adrian had been explicit she was on paid medical leave, full salary, no obligation to return until she was ready, and when she was ready, he wanted to talk about what that return looked like and whether the current role still made sense. All of that had been communicated through Evelyn in a handwritten note that was also typed, because Evelyn was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they have seen enough situations go wrong from ambiguity. But Elena needed to be in the house. She needed to walk the East Operations corridor and verify the camera positioning, and understand exactly which 3 minutes of blindness Graham had bought with that instruction to the security officer. She needed to see the East Operations Office again, with what she now knew, and look at it differently than she had before. And she needed to do it without Graham knowing that was what she was doing. She was very good at being in places without people knowing that was what she was doing. That at least remained exactly as useful as it had always been. She arrived at 6:45. The morning staff was already moving. The house had the particular quality of a place that has had something serious happen in it recently and is still adjusting to itself, slightly too quiet in some rooms, slightly too loud in others, people performing normalcy with a little too much visible effort. Graham Hale arrived at 8:15. Elena knew his schedule. She had always known it, the way she knew everyone's schedule. Because knowing schedules was how you made sure you were never in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was in the east corridor when he walked past. She was carrying a supply cart head down, moving at the specific pace of a person doing a routine task with routine efficiency. He did not look at her. He never did. He went into the East Operations Office and closed the door. Elena kept moving. She reached the junction at the end of the corridor and stopped. She looked up at the camera positioned above the service entrance. She counted the angle. She thought about the word exactly. Exactly 3 minutes. She pulled out the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, not a phone. A physical notebook, because phones had records, and records could be checked, and she wrote down 4 numbers. The camera number, the corridor section, the angle of coverage, and the measurement in feet between the camera and the service entrance door. Then she wrote something else. A name, not Graham's name. A different name. The name of the security officer Graham had been speaking to that afternoon at the service entrance. She had not mentioned that name to Adrian. She had described the interaction, but not the officer, because at the time she had been more focused on Graham and the lighter than on the person Graham was talking to, and she had not yet been certain of the officer's identity. She was certain now. She had walked past the security rotation 3 times this morning before she was sure enough to write it down. The security officer's name was Denny Watts. He had worked at the estate for 4 years. He was 29, had a wife and a daughter, and owned a car that was significantly nicer than the one his salary should have been able to support. She noted that too. She went back to work. She was patient. She had always been patient. Patience was the skill you developed when you could not afford to be impulsive, and Elena had been developing it her entire life. At 11:30, she had what she needed. She sent Evelyn a text, not Adrian, Evelyn, because Evelyn was the one whose communications Graham had no reason to monitor, that said simply, "I need to speak with Adrian today, this afternoon if possible, about the thing we discussed in the hospital. I have more." Evelyn replied in 4 minutes, 3 o'clock, my sitting room. Elena sent back, "Thank you." She went back to the supply cart and finished the East Wing. The meeting at 3 o'clock lasted 45 minutes. She walked Adrian through everything: the camera angles, the measurement, the name Denny Watts, the car, the timeline. She laid it out the way she had laid things out in her head, in sequence, with the specific connections made visible. Adrian listened without interrupting. This was something she had noticed about him in the hospital, that when he was receiving information he considered genuinely important, he went completely still and completely silent and gave it the full and undivided focus of a person who had learned that the cost of missing something was higher than the cost of asking someone to wait. It was different from the listening that most powerful people performed, which was the kind where they were already formulating their response while you were still talking. He was actually listening. It changed things slightly in her internal accounting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Denny Watts has been with us 4 years. Yes. Graham recruited him directly, bypassed the standard vetting process. I remember approving it because Graham vouched for him personally, and I trusted Graham's judgment." The last 5 words came out with a specific flatness that said everything about what that trust was currently worth to him. "If you move on Watts directly, Graham will know within an hour," Elena said. "Watts reports to Graham on the security rotation. It's in the scheduling records I checked this morning." Adrian looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize. It was the expression he made when she said something that landed slightly ahead of where he was, and he was recalibrating. "You check the scheduling records. I have access to the household management system for supply ordering." She met his gaze. "I may have looked at more than the supply section." A beat. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was almost but not quite a smile. "I see. The point is," Elena continued, Graham still thinks this is contained. He thinks you believe Raymond acted alone. He thinks his exposure is limited. If you move on Watts, he knows the picture is widened. And if he knows that, he moves faster than you're ready for. Adrian nodded slowly. So we let him believe he's still in control. For a few more days. Yes, and while he believes that, you pull the encrypted records from the East Operations Office server. Quietly. Through someone Graham doesn't know has access. The financial records specifically, I think the arrangement with Raymond predates the gala. I think there's a pattern in those records that shows it. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. How do you know about the East Operations server? Elena held his gaze. I clean that office. I have cleaned it for 2 years. I know where everything in it is, including the server rack behind the second filing cabinet. She paused. Nobody notices the person cleaning the office. The silence that followed, that was the particular silence of a man recalibrating something fundamental about the situation he was in. Not uncomfortable exactly. More like the feeling of a room after someone opens a window you didn't know was there. No, Adrian said quietly, I suppose they don't. He reached a decision. She could see it, the specific quality of stillness that came immediately before he moved. I'll have the server access tonight. Independent technician, someone Graham has never met. The records will be pulled and duplicated before morning. Don't tell Morris, Elena said, or Reyes, or anyone on the operations side. She said it directly with no apology for overstepping because they were past the part of this where she was performing deference. I don't know who else is connected to Graham. I only know about Watts with certainty. Adrian absorbed this. Who do you trust on the security side? Henderson, she said immediately. He was the one complaining about the scanner shutdown. He didn't know it was coming, and he was genuinely angry about it. Someone who is part of the arrangement doesn't complain to a colleague about it in a corridor. Adrian nodded once. He made a note. Actual pen and paper. She approved of that. There is one more thing, she said. He looked up. Graham is going to make another move. He has to. The first one failed, and he is not the kind of man who abandons a plan. He is the kind of man who adapts it. And the adapted version is going to be faster and less elegant than the first one, because he is now operating under time pressure. She paused. He is going to come at you directly, or at your mother again, or at me if he figures out that I am closer to this than he thinks. Adrian's expression did something complicated. I'm going to have security increased on this floor and on Evelyn's wing. Don't change the rotation visibly. Use Henderson to add coverage without adjusting the official schedule. If Graham sees the schedule change, he'll know something shifted. Elena. She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the recalibrating look, and not the controlled professional look, and not the specific look he had had in the hospital when he'd said every decision about your future is yours. This was something different, something quieter and more direct. What? She said. Are you all right? Not the investigation. You, as a person. 8 days ago, you were in an ambulance, and today you are in my house reconstructing a conspiracy and telling me how to protect my operation. And I want to know, in between all of that, are you actually all right? Elena opened her mouth, closed it. She had not been prepared for that question. In her experience, the people who employed her asked about the work, and the people who were grateful to her asked about her health, and neither of those were this. This was something else. This was someone asking her as a specific human being rather than as a function or a symbol. She thought about what Maya had said that morning. Stop pretending you're invisible. Stop acting like you don't take up space. I'm scared, she said. It came out before she had finished deciding to say it. Not of Graham exactly. I know how to be careful. I'm scared of what happens if we get this right, and it still doesn't change anything. If the evidence is good enough and the case is solid and all of it gets handed over, and it still just disappears into whatever mechanism exists for making things like this disappear. Adrian held her gaze. He did not rush to reassure her, which she noticed and appreciated. He let the fear be real for a moment before he responded to it. That is a reasonable thing to be scared of, he said. And I don't have a guarantee for you. What I have is this: I am not going to let it disappear. And I know that my word on that means very little right now, given everything else you have just found out about how much has been happening without my knowledge in my own organization. He paused. So I am going to show you, one step at a time, until the word means something. Elena considered that. It was the honest answers. It was the only honest answer available. And she had enough respect for honest answers to receive it as what it was. Okay, she said. She went back to work. He went to make phone calls she was not party to. Evelyn appeared at the door of the sitting room approximately 30 seconds after Adrian left it and said, Tea? In a tone of voice that made it clear the tea was not optional. Elena sat back down. Evelyn made the tea herself rather than calling for it, which was a deliberate choice, and they both knew it. And they sat together in the sitting room while the afternoon light moved and said things that were not about the investigation at all, about Maya's nursing program, about the college Elena had left and whether she had ever thought about going back, about the specific and underappreciated skill of being observant in a world that consistently rewarded being loud. It was the most normal 40 minutes Elena had spent in 3 weeks. She held on to it. 2 days later, the records from the East Operations server arrived in a form that Adrian's independent technician described as comprehensive. Elena was not in the room when Adrian reviewed them. She did not need to be. She received a text from Evelyn at 11:45 that night that said only, "You were right about the pattern, more than we thought." She lay in her bed in the small apartment she was back to paying rent on, the one with the repaired mattress. Spring Adrian had addressed that without being asked, through the restitution process, and she had let it happen because her back was grateful even when her pride was complicated about it, and she looked and felt the specific sensation of being right about something terrible. It was not satisfaction. It was closer to grief. Because being right about Graham Hale meant that a man Adrian had trusted since childhood, a man Evelyn had known for 30 years, a man who had sat at family dinners and attended funerals and been present at every milestone of this family's life, that man had spent the last several years constructing a careful architecture of betrayal, and the foundation of it was financial, and it was deep, and it went back much further than the gala. The records showed it clearly. Graham had been diverting funds into a series of accounts structured to obscure the trail. Some of those funds had moved to Raymond Vescari's operation. The arrangement was at least 2 years old, and embedded in the transfer records, in the specific timing and amounts, was something that told a story about motive that was more complex than simple greed. Graham had been positioning himself, building a coalition, preparing for a transfer of power that was supposed to happen, not through any public event, but through the quiet, inevitable consequence of Adrian Hawthorne losing his mother, losing the only person inside the organization whose moral authority exceeded his own, and fracturing under the weight of that grief at exactly the moment his reforms had made him most vulnerable. It was cold. It was patient. It was 30 years of trusted proximity deployed as a weapon. Elena thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it felt like to be inside a system and not see it. She thought about Adrian, who had spent 4 days in a hospital chair and come out of it doing the thing most people in his position would never do. She thought about the fact that the cruelest betrayals are always the ones that come from the direction where you were looking for safety. She slept badly and woke early and was in the kitchen at 5:30 with her coffee before anyone else arrived. At 6:15, Henderson texted a message to a number he had been given 48 hours ago by Adrian. The message said, "Movement on camera 3, East Wing, unscheduled." Elena read the forwarded message on Evelyn's tablet at 6:17 because she was in Evelyn's sitting room delivering morning tea, which was the role she had resumed and which Graham had no reason to interpret as anything other than routine. She set down the tea. She looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was already looking at her. "He's moving," Evelyn said. It was not a question. "Yes," Elena said. "He's moving." And somewhere in the east wing of the Hawthorne estate, Graham Hale was walking down a corridor he believed was unmonitored, toward a room where he believed the balance of power was still arranged the way he had arranged it, with a plan that he believed was still intact. He had no idea that the woman he had spent months failing to notice had spent those same months noticing everything. He was about to find out what that cost. The message from Henderson hit at 6:17, and by 6:22, Elena had already moved. Not in a panic, not running. She moved the way she always moved, with the controlled, deliberate efficiency of someone who had spent years making sure that her movements through this house were unremarkable. She set Evelyn's tea tray on the side table. She straightened the cup. She looked at Evelyn and said quietly and clearly, "Lock this door after me. Do not open it for anyone except Adrian or Henderson. Not housekeeping. Not kitchen staff. Nobody you did not see with your own eyes this morning." Evelyn did not argue. She did not ask questions. She stood up from her chair with the particular steadiness of a woman who has faced serious things before and has learned that steadiness is its own form of protection. "Go," she said. Elena went. The east wing at 6:20 in the morning was not empty, but it was close. The overnight staff was finishing rotations. The morning staff was just beginning. There was a window of approximately 20 minutes where the corridor traffic was minimal, and the camera coverage, if you knew which cameras Graham had access to, through Denny Watts had a gap that someone had very carefully not reported as a gap. Elena knew about that gap. She had mapped it 11 days ago, standing at the supply cart junction with her small notebook. She also knew that Adrian had quietly installed 2 additional cameras in that gap 3 days ago, positioned at angles that did not match any existing camera on the official security schematic. Henderson had done it himself at 2 in the morning with a technician who had been driven to the estate in an unmarked car. Graham had not been informed. Denny Watts had not been informed. The new cameras did not appear on any system Graham had access to. They were transmitting to Henderson's personal tablet right now. Elena did not go directly to the East Wing. She went to the service corridor that ran parallel to it, the one that connected the East Operations section to the household supply area. She knew this corridor the way she knew her own heartbeat. She had walked it hundreds of times. She knew which floorboard at the 14-foot mark had a slight creak, which door frame had swollen slightly in the humidity and needed a specific angle of approach to open quietly, which stretches of corridor had acoustic properties that carried sound further than you expected. She stopped at the junction point where the service corridor met the East Wing access door. She listened, deliberate, not hurrying. The footsteps of someone who believed they were unobserved and was moving with the quiet confidence of a person executing a plan they had rehearsed. She texted Adrian. 2 words East Wing now. His reply came in 11 seconds. On my way. Stay back. She put the phone in her apron pocket and stayed exactly where she was, which was not back. She was not going to be back. She was going to be precisely where she needed to be, which was at the junction point, with the access door between her and the East Wing corridor, positioned to hear everything that happened next without being visible to anyone approaching from either direction. This was not recklessness. This was calculation. If Graham reached the recovery suite, the room on the East Wing that Adrian had been using as a secondary office since the gala, where the server records had been accessed, and where Elena knew, from Evelyn's text last night, that Adrian had been working late and had not yet left this morning, then the window for intervention would be short, very short. She needed to be close enough to matter. She waited. The footsteps continued. She heard the East Wing access door at the far end open, the one near the operations office, not the one she was standing beside, which meant Graham had come from the operations side, which meant he had been in the office before this, which meant he had checked something, or retrieved something, or destroyed something before making his move. Her stomach tightened. She filed the feeling and kept thinking. She heard a second set of footsteps, lighter and faster, coming from the main corridor direction. Henderson, moving quickly but not running, because running in a household corridor at 6 in the morning announces itself in a way that deliberate walking does not. She texted Henderson. He came from the ops office first. May have accessed or cleared something there. Do not lose that room. Henderson's reply, Reyes is on the ops office now. Doors sealed, Elena breathed. Good. Whatever Graham had gone to retrieve or destroy was now locked behind a door he did not know was locked. That was one piece secured. Now for the harder piece. She heard Graham's footsteps stop, heard a knock, 3 times. The specific knock, she knew this. She had heard it before. It was the knock Graham used when entering Adrian's spaces. The one that had the practiced quality of a man who had been walking into rooms in this house for 30 years and had a specific pattern he used, always, for reasons of habit or superstition, or simply the kind of embedded routine that becomes invisible when you have done it long enough. She heard Adrian's voice from inside. Come in. She heard the door open, and she heard nothing for approximately 4 seconds, which was the length of time it took for 2 men who had known each other for most of one of their lives to face each other across a room with the full weight of what was happening between them. Then Graham Hale spoke. You look tired, he said. The voice was the same as it always was, measured, smooth, with the particular timbre of a man who has spent decades being the most experienced person in every room and has calibrated his voice accordingly. You should get some rest. This has been a difficult 2 weeks. It has, Adrian said. His voice was even, controlled. Sit down, Graham. A pause. I'd rather stand. I'd rather you sat. Longer this time. Elena held very still. She heard the sound of a chair being pulled. Graham sat. The server records, Adrian said. Not a question. Just those 3 words, delivered with the flatness of someone laying a card on a table. The silence that followed was different from the other silences Elena had cataloged in this situation. This one was the silence of a calculation being run in real time by a man who was very fast at calculations. She could almost feel it through the door. I don't know what records you're referring to, Graham said. Still smooth, still measured. The operations server runs routine. Graham Adrian's voice cut across his cleanly. Not loud, just precise. I have 2 years of transfer records. I have the account structures. I have the connection to Vescari's operation. I have dates and amounts that align with specific events in the estate's security history that I had not previously understood the significance of. A pause. I have all of it. The quality of the silence changed again. Elena heard something shift. A small sound, not quite a breath, not quite movement. The sound of a person absorbing an impact and adjusting their weight. The sound of a plan being abandoned and a new one being opened. You have been busy, Graham said. His voice had changed. Not dramatically. Just slightly. The smoothness was still there, but something underneath it had compressed, the way a structure compresses when the load on it exceeds its design tolerance. Someone help me see clearly, Adrian said, the maid. Graham's voice was flat now. Not a question. Not contemptuous. Just flat. The way a man speaks when he has arrived at the specific information that explains the gap in his plan and finds it to be something he should have seen coming. You're telling me the maid is the one who... Her name is Elena Brooks, Adrian said. The words came out with a precision that made them sound like a correction and a warning simultaneously. And yes, a beat. Then Graham said something that Elena had not expected. He said, smart girl. And he said it with what sounded genuinely like a form of recognition. Not admiration exactly, but the acknowledgement of a professional who has just understood that they were outmaneuvered by someone they underestimated. You should have done a great many things differently, Adrian said. Starting 30 years ago, maybe. Or 2 years ago. Or the moment you decided that my mother's life was an acceptable cost for a transfer of power. The words landed. Elena heard them land through the door. She heard the specific quality of air in a room when something true and terrible has been said out loud for the first time. Graham was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, the voice was different. Not the smooth, managed voice of the operations chief. Something older. Something that had more weight in it. And something that was, she thought, possibly the first genuine thing he had said in this entire conversation. Your father would have never pushed us this far, Graham said. The reforms, the divestments, the outside auditors. He understood that the organization had to work with certain realities. He accepted that. He built it that way on purpose. And then he died and you decided to tear it down. And everything he built, everyone who built it with him. He stopped. We were going to be casualties of your idealism. I decided to prevent that. By killing my mother. By making a transition that would have been by killing my mother, Graham. Adrian's voice had gone very quiet. The specific quiet that is the opposite of calm. Say it plainly. We are past the point of framing. A long silence. Yes, Graham said, flat final, by killing your mother. Elena closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them and focused, and kept listening. And then what? Adrian asked after she was gone. After you blamed the death on my reforms having weakened security. Then what? Then the organization would have demanded stability. The people who have been watching your legitimacy project with increasing concern would have moved to protect their interests. I would have been positioned as the experienced hand. The transition would have been, he paused, managed. And Vescari? Vescari gets what he was promised. A seat at the table, a partnership. The friction between our operations goes away. Graham's voice was steady, professional. He was describing this the way he would describe any operations plan. Your father would have understood this. The math makes sense. The math includes murdering your employer's mother. The math, Graham said, is what keeps 300 people employed and out of federal custody. What keeps 20 years of careful work from being dismantled by someone who inherited it and decided he knew better. His voice hardened slightly, not much, just enough to show the edge underneath. You are not your father, Adrian, and some of us have been watching you mistake ambition for wisdom for 3 years. And yet Adrian said quietly, here we are, a sound, movement. Elena was already moving her hand toward the door. She heard Graham's chair push back. She heard him stand. She heard the shift in the room, the specific physical change that happens when someone in an enclosed space makes the decision to move toward rather than away. She hit the access door and was through it in one motion. The recovery suite door was 15 feet down the corridor. It was open. Graham had not closed it behind him, which told her the conversation had not been intended to end this way, that Graham had come in still operating on the possibility of managing Adrian of finding some version of the script where he could still control the outcome. She went through the door. Graham was on his feet between Adrian and the room's secondary exit, the connecting door to the East Operations Corridor, which he clearly knew about and which he was now positioning himself to use. He had something in his right hand. Not a weapon exactly. A phone. His encrypted phone. His index finger was moving on the screen with the fast, purposeful motion of someone deleting something critical as quickly as possible. Adrian was on the other side of the room, standing, watching Graham with an expression that was completely unreadable from where Elena was standing, which meant it was the expression he used when he was in the kind of situation where showing your reaction first was a form of losing. Graham saw Elena come through the door. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. The moment where the gap in his plan finally had a name and a face and was standing 12 feet away from him in a household apron. "You," he said. "Me," Elena said. For a fraction of a second, all three of them were completely still. Then Graham moved toward the connecting door, still working the phone with his right hand. And Elena saw two things simultaneously: that he was almost done with whatever he was deleting, and that he was standing directly beneath the emergency medical alarm panel that had been installed in this room when it was converted for Evelyn's cardiac monitoring. The same panel, the same system she had read about in the estate's household emergency manual, which she had read 14 months ago during the mandatory staff safety training that everyone else had treated as an administrative inconvenience, and she had treated as information. She moved left, not toward Graham, away from, toward the monitoring station on the east wall. Graham tracked her, which meant he looked away from Adrian for exactly the time it took to confirm she was not coming directly at him. She hit the medical alarm with her palm. The sound was immediate, not a quiet alarm, not a discreet notification, but the full emergency activation, loud and sharp, and instantly transmitting to the estate's security center and to Henderson's personal tablet and to the monitoring system that Adrian had quietly connected to a federal liaison contact 3 days ago when the server records had arrived. Simultaneously, the reinforced safety doors installed for Evelyn's protection triggered automatically by the medical alarm engaged. The connecting door to the East Operations Corridor sealed with an audible thud. The main door behind Elena sealed. The room locked. Graham spun toward the connecting door, realized it was sealed, turned back. Adrian was already moving. Graham was bigger, and he was faster than a man his age should have been, and he had the particular physical confidence of someone who had spent 30 years being the most dangerous person in most rooms. But he had also just spent 30 seconds focused on his phone and on Elena, and he had looked away from Adrian for the span of one breath. Adrian hit him at the shoulder, controlled and precise. The kind of physical move that is not about strength but about leverage and timing. And Graham went sideways, catching himself on the monitoring station, and the phone skittered across the floor and landed face down against the baseboard. Graham straightened. His breath was harder now. His eyes moved between Adrian and Elena and the sealed doors and the phone on the floor. And Elena watched him run the calculation and arrive at the answer. There was no version of the next 60 seconds that ended in his favor. She saw the moment he understood that. She saw it in his face, not defeat exactly. Because Graham Hale was not the kind of man who registered defeat as an emotion. He registered it as a data point, the same way he had registered everything else for 30 years. The expression was something more like the specific stillness of a man who has reached the end of his options and is now deciding what to do with his hands. He put his hands up. Not high, not dramatic, just enough. The phone, Elena said. She did not address Graham. She addressed Adrian. The deletion wasn't complete. Whatever he was trying to clear, if the recovery team moves on it immediately, they'll have most of it. Adrian did not look at her when she said it. He kept his eyes on Graham, but his chin moved a single fractional nod. The doors unsealed 30 seconds later as Henderson's team overrode from the security center. 3 of them came through the main door. Henderson first, then 2 others she recognized from the overnight rotation. They moved the way trained people move in a situation that is under control, but is not yet entirely finished quickly, professionally, without excess. Henderson picked up the phone from the baseboard without touching its screen. He bagged it. He looked at Elena. He said, "Nice alarm call." "Thank you," she said. Graham was escorted to a position near the wall. He did not resist. He did not speak. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Adrian with an expression that Elena could not fully read, but that had in it something that was not quite anger and not quite remorse. Something in between those two things. Something that might have been, underneath everything else, the specific grief of a man who had just watched a relationship of 30 years end in a sealed room at 6:45 in the morning. Adrian looked back at him for a long moment. The room was quiet except for the sounds of Henderson's team and the continued low tone of the medical alarm, which Henderson reached across and silenced. Adrian said, "Graham." Graham looked at him. "My father trusted you with everything." Adrian's voice was very quiet, not angry. Something past anger. He trusted you with his business and his family and his legacy. And you spent 2 years dismantling that trust from the inside. And you tried to kill my mother to protect the dismantled version. He paused. "I need you to understand something before these men walk you out of my house." Graham waited. "I am not going to handle this the way my father would have handled it," Adrian said. "Not because I don't have the means, but because I am trying to be something different than what this house has been. And the only way to be that is to make a different choice, even when the choice I want to make is the other one." A beat. "What does that mean?" Graham asked. His voice was flat. "Controlled. It means federal investigators receive everything. The records, the phone, the transfer documents, the connection to Vescari. Everything." Adrian held his gaze. "It means you answer to the law, not to me." Graham was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father would have called that weakness." "My father is gone," Adrian said. "And you helped make his legacy the kind that needed to be dismantled. So his opinion has limited standing here." He turned away. He looked at Elena, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had seen from him since the hospital, since the moment she had opened her eyes and he had been in the chair and his face had done that uncontrolled human thing that powerful men spend their lives preventing. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about the question, really thought about it, the way she had been learning to, with the same attention she gave to everything else. Instead of the automatic "fine, yes, don't worry about me" that had been her default for 24 years. "I will be," she said, and meant it. He nodded. Then he looked at Henderson. "Get him out of my house." Henderson moved. Graham Hale, operations chief of the Hawthorne organization for 11 years, and trusted advisor of the Hawthorne family for 30, was walked out of the recovery suite and down the east wing corridor without further event. He did not look back. Elena stood in the room after he was gone and let herself breathe. Just breathe. The alarm was off, and the doors were unsealed, and the morning light was doing whatever morning light does at 6:45, and the house was making its normal sounds again, the sounds of a household resuming, of staff going about morning tasks, of the city outside doing what it does. She became aware, after a moment, that Adrian had not left the room. He was standing near the window, his back partly turned, with the quality of someone who has just gone through something serious and is now doing the quiet work of deciding how to carry it forward. She recognized that quality. She had spent a great deal of time doing that exact thing. She said, "The evidence will hold." "Yes," he said. "The federal contact you established, they move fast on encrypted records. They've already been contacted. The liaison has been standing by since yesterday morning." He turned, looked at her. "Elena, I need to say something to you, and I need you to let me say it without deflecting." She held his gaze. "Okay. You have saved my mother's life, my operation, and my own life in the space of 2 weeks. You have done it while recovering from being poisoned, while managing everything else you were managing, and while being employed by a household that was until recently treating you in ways I am deeply ashamed of." He stopped, let a breath out. "I know what I have said about your independence and your choices and your future being yours. I mean all of it. I am not trying to replace one form of obligation with another." He met her eyes. "But I am asking, not telling. Asking whether you would consider staying. Not as my employee. Not under any arrangement that looks like what the last 3 years have looked like, but in a capacity that actually reflects what you bring to this." He paused. "To whatever this becomes." Elena was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the education fund for Maya, which she had accepted with conditions and documentation. She thought about the attorney she had chosen herself, who had reviewed everything and confirmed it was clean. She thought about the college application she had looked up twice in the last week and not yet submitted. She thought about what Evelyn had said, about mistakes in time and the slow, imperfect process of building something better out of what was broken. "I am going back to school," she said. "That is not negotiable and not dependent on anything else. I am going to study what I am good at, and I am going to build something that is mine." "I know," he said. "I would not ask you to put that aside for any reason. In whatever role I have here, if I have one, it is defined by me. Not inherited from 3 years of being overlooked. Built from what I actually am." Yes, he said, exactly that. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she said, ask me again in a month, after the federal process starts, after the dust settles. Ask me when things are quieter and you have had time to make sure you mean it without the adrenaline. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one. Fair, I'm serious. I know you are. That's the part I find most clarifying. He straightened. 1 month. 1 month, she agreed. She picked up her supply cart from the corridor, where she had left it the prop she had maintained throughout all of this, the tray and the linens, and the small notebook in the apron pocket, the visible markers of the invisibility she had spent years perfecting, and was now, slowly and deliberately, beginning to set down. She walked the corridor with it one more time, because the morning still needed to run, and there was work to finish. And Elena Brooks had never in her life left work unfinished. But she walked it differently than she had this morning, and differently than she had for 3 years before that. She walked it knowing that the camera in the East Junction was new and was working. She walked it knowing that the records were secured, and the phone was bagged, and Graham Hale was out of the building. She walked it knowing that Evelyn was safe behind a locked door that had been opened by now, that Evelyn was probably making tea again, because that was what Evelyn did when things resolved, made tea, and returned to her paperback and waited for the world to confirm that steadiness was the right response. She walked it knowing that she had been invisible in this house for 3 years, and that in the space of 2 weeks she had become, for better and for worse and for everything in between, impossible to overlook. Down the corridor, Adrian Hawthorne was on the phone with his federal liaison. His voice was steady and precise and carried the authority of a man who has made a decision and is not looking back from it. She could hear him as she moved away, not the words exactly, just the tone of it, the specific quality of a man doing something he could have chosen not to do and has chosen to do anyway. She had told him once, if you want to build something better, don't answer betrayal with another secret grave. He had heard her, not just listened, heard. She rounded the corner, and the corridor opened up into the main wing, and the house was bright with morning. And Elena Brooks had a supply cart to finish and a college application to submit in a month to figure out what came next. She thought that was enough. For right now. She thought that was exactly enough. The college application took her 4 days to finish. Not because it was complicated. Elena had always been good at the practical mechanics of things, forms, documents, deadlines, the specific discipline of getting something done when it needed to be done. The application itself was straightforward. Criminal justice program, State University. Strong academic record from before she had left, strong enough that the admissions office had sent a note 3 years ago saying the door was still open when she was ready. The 4 days were not about the form. They were about sitting down in front of it and allowing herself to believe, without qualification and without the automatic internal voice that said not yet or not now, or there are other things that need to come first, that this was something she was allowed to want for herself, that her own future was not a luxury to be scheduled after everything else was handled. Maya had been saying this for 2 years. Evelyn had been saying it for 18 months. Adrian had been saying it for 3 weeks. In the careful, measured way he said things now, the way of a man who had learned the difference between offering and insisting and was working, visibly and imperfectly, to stay on the right side of that line. Elena had heard all of them. She had heard them and filed it away the way she filed most things, in the holding area where she put information that she was not ready to act on yet. And then one evening, 3 weeks after the morning, in the recovery suite, she sat down at the small table in her apartment with a cup of coffee, and she opened the application, and she wrote the personal statement in one sitting without stopping to second guess it. And she bat it back once, and she was done. She read the part of her brain that had been talking her out of things for 24 years, could organize a counter-argument. She texted Maya, submitted. Maya's response came in 40 seconds, which meant she had been waiting. It was a single line, I knew you would. I love you. Don't you dare cry before I get there, Elena cried. Not dramatically. Just quietly, at the kitchen table, the way you cry when something you have been holding at a careful distance finally arrives close enough to touch. She gave herself 4 minutes. Then she washed her face and went back to work. The federal investigation moved faster than Elena had expected, and she had expected it to move fast. The encrypted phone that Henderson had bagged in the recovery suite turned out to contain records that the federal liaison described, in the careful understatement of a person trained not to editorialize, as extremely comprehensive. Graham had kept documentation of everything: the transfers, the communications with Vescari, the specific instructions to Denny Watts about the scanner shutdown and the camera blind spot, the timeline of the plan's construction going back 26 months. He had kept it because he had expected to need it as leverage. Someday in a negotiation he had anticipated having with people who would eventually discover pieces of what he had done and would need to be reminded of what he knew about them. He had not anticipated that the negotiation would never happen, that the leverage would simply become evidence. Denny Watts was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his home before he arrived for his shift. His wife called the estate in a panic. Elena was not there when the call came in, but Evelyn told her about it that afternoon in the sitting room over the tea that had become a regular fixture of their afternoons together. She had no idea, Evelyn said. The wife, she had absolutely no idea. I know, Elena said. That's the part that stays with me. The people adjacent to these things who simply had no idea. Evelyn looked at her hands for a moment. I had no idea about Graham. 30 years and I had no idea. Elena looked at her carefully. Evelyn had not spoken much about Graham since the morning in the recovery suite. She had been steady, she was always steady, but Elena had learned in these weeks of afternoon tea to read the specific texture of Evelyn's steadiness. The difference between the steadiness that was ease and the steadiness that was work. This was work, you trusted him, Elena said. That's not the same as being foolish. No, Evelyn agreed, but it feels similar from the inside. 30 years of someone being trustworthy is reasonable evidence that they are trustworthy. He changed. Or he was always more complicated than what he showed, and the conditions changed enough that the complicated part became the dominant one. Elena paused. Either way, that's on him, not on you for not seeing what he was deliberately hiding. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Elena with the expression she used when Elena said something that mattered to her. When did you get this wise? I have always been this wise, Elena said. Nobody asked me before. Evelyn laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that lives in the whole chest, and Elena felt the relief of it, the specific relief of hearing someone you care about laugh genuinely after a period of sustained difficulty. Raymond Vescari was arrested 4 days after Graham. The federal case against him was built partly on the server records from the estate, and partly on communications found on Graham's phone, and partly on the testimony of 3 of Vescari's own associates who, faced with the comprehensiveness of the evidence available, made the entirely rational decision that cooperation was the better available outcome. His lawyers issued a statement. The statement was, in Elena's private assessment, extraordinarily optimistic about the legal situation, but that was between Vescari, his legal team, and the federal prosecutors, and none of those parties were asking for her input. The violent conflict that Graham and Vescari had been counting on, the one that was supposed to erupt from Evelyn's death, from Adrian's grief-driven instability, from the power vacuum that Graham had positioned himself to fill, never happened. Adrian had turned the evidence over before any of the faction leaders, who might have moved opportunistically, had been able to confirm what was happening. The federal process had moved fast enough to contain the situation before it could metastasize. 300 people, who worked in legitimate operations connected to the Hawthorne organization, went to work the week after the arrests the same way they had gone the week before. Elena thought about that. She thought about it the way she thought about most things that mattered, carefully from multiple angles, making sure she understood the full shape of it. It was not a small thing that 300 people's lives had continued without disruption. It was not a small thing that the war Graham had been willing to start, the one that would have spread outward from the Hawthorne organization into Chicago neighborhoods and families and lives that had nothing to do with any of this, had been stopped before it started. It was not a small thing, and it had happened because a man she had spent 3 weeks carefully reassessing had made a choice that cost him leverage and control, and the kind of fear-based authority that criminal organizations run on, and had made it anyway. She thought Adrian deserved to know that she noticed. She told him 1 month to the day after she had told him to ask her again when the dust settled. She told him in the east corridor of the Hawthorne estate, which she was walking for what she had decided would be the last time in her current capacity. Her last shift in the household role she had held for 3 years. She had given proper notice, documented properly, with a formal letter reviewed by the independent attorney she had chosen herself. Adrian was waiting at the end of the corridor. Not coincidentally, she had told him she would be finishing her last shift at 4 o'clock. He was there at 4 o'clock. She said, "You chose right." He said, "Tell me what you mean." Turning the evidence over, not handling it privately, not making Vescari and Graham disappear into whatever mechanism exists for making people disappear. She held his gaze. You chose the harder thing, and I noticed. He was quiet for him. It cost me, I know. Several of the faction leaders interpreted it as weakness. 3 of them have been repositioning themselves, testing boundaries. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said things that were simply true. It's going to be an ongoing negotiation. Yes, she said. Probably. But the people who work in your legitimate operations are not going to be the casualties of a war that never happened. And that matters. Elena. He said her name the way he had started saying it, without the weight of employer or gratitude or obligation. Just her name, I told you 1 month. It has been 1 month. I am asking. She had already made the decision. She had made it 11 days ago, quietly, the same way she made most decisions after sufficient information had accumulated, and the picture was clear enough that she trusted what she was looking at. I have been accepted to the criminal justice program, she said. I start in the fall. It is a 4-year degree and I intend to take it seriously and finish it. Good, he said. While I am in school, I am open to a consultancy arrangement, specifically around security systems and employee-facing operations. Not in any capacity that involves working for you, working with you, on specific defined projects with documented terms reviewed by my attorney. Agreed. And separately from all of that, she stopped. Let a breath out. Separately from all of that, I am willing to see what this is. Between us. Without it being entangled with work or obligation, or what you owe me, or what I owe you. Starting from the actual beginning, which means slowly and honestly, and with both of us allowed to say when something is not working. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. She had learned over these weeks to let his silences be silences, not to fill them, not to interpret them too quickly. He thought before he spoke, always. And that was a quality she had come to understand was not coldness but precision. Yes, he said to all of it. She nodded once, then she said, there is one more thing, and this one is not about us. He weighted the domestic workers, the people in households and service operations across this city who are in situations that look like what I was in 3 years ago. The overtime theft, the debt arrangements, the contracts designed to prevent recourse. She held his gaze. I want to build something, a real structure, support, confidential reporting, education access, not a charity project with my name on it. A functioning organization with actual resources and independent governance. She paused. I need a founding donor. Someone with reach and resources and who is, at this particular moment in his life, highly motivated to demonstrate that his organization takes this seriously. Something moved in his expression. You have already designed it. I have been working on it for 6 days. I have a framework document. I have a list of legal and operational partners I want to approach. I have a name, she paused. The Brooks Hawthorne Workplace Protection Initiative. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him process it, not the name. She knew the name was not the thing he was processing. He was processing what the name represented. The specific construction of it, her name first, both names together, the statement embedded in the order. You put your name first, he said. It was my idea, she said simply. He nodded. And something in him relaxed, slightly, in the specific way of someone who has been waiting to see what kind of person they are dealing with and has just received a piece of confirming evidence. The funding is yours, whatever structure you need. Reviewed by your attorney, governed independently, no organizational influence from my side beyond the initial contribution. I know, she said. That is why I came to you with it. He understood what that meant. She saw him understand it. You trust that I won't interfere. I trust that you are working hard not to be the kind of person who would, which is different and more honest, and I prefer it. She let a small beat pass. Don't make me regret it. I won't, he said. They stood in the east corridor of the Hawthorne estate, and the house made its sounds around them, and the city continued outside, and all of the weight of the past month sat in the air between them with the specific gravity of things that have been earned rather than given. She said, I need to turn in my access card. He said, I know. HR is expecting you. A pause in Elena. She was already turning. She looked back. Thank you, he said. Not for saving Evelyn. Not for the operation or the evidence or the recovery suite. He said it the way you say it when you mean the whole of something and cannot reduce it to a list. For all of it. For being, he stopped, for being exactly who you are. Elena held his gaze for one moment. I've always been exactly who I am, she said. People just kept not noticing. She turned the access card into HR. She walked out of the Hawthorne estate through the main entrance, which was something she had never done in 3 years of employment there. She had always used the service entrance, the household staff door. The back route that invisible people use when they have learned to make themselves small enough to fit through spaces that powerful places leave for the people they don't fully count. She used the main entrance today. Nobody stopped her. Nobody looked twice. She went home and she called Maya and she said, "I did the thing." Maya said, "Which thing?" "All of them," Elena said. Maya made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob and said, "Give me details immediately." She gave her details. Not all of them, some of them, belonged to the specific quiet that Elena kept for herself, the internal accounting that was hers alone. But enough. She told her about the initiative and about school in the fall and about the East Corridor and the main entrance and what it had felt like to walk out of a building through the front door. Maya was quiet for a moment after that last part. Then she said, "Mom would have loved this." Elena did not speak for a moment. "Yeah," she said finally. She would have. 1 year later, Elena Brooks stood at a podium in the Hawthorne ballroom and looked out at 300 people who had come to attend the first annual fundraising gala of the Brooks-Hawthorne Workplace Protection Initiative. There were legal professionals and academics and community organizers and domestic workers who had been helped by the initiative in its first year of operation. There were city officials and labor advocates and 3 federal investigators who had worked the Vescari Hale case and had, in the course of that work, developed a productive relationship with the initiative's confidential reporting infrastructure. Maya was in the front row in her nursing graduation dress because she had graduated 6 weeks ago and she wore that dress to everything she considered important enough to mark, which Elena found both slightly excessive and deeply endearing. Evelyn was 2 rows back. Her health had been better this year, genuinely better, the cardiologist had said, in the careful language of a person who does not want to overstate, but there had been measurable improvement. Evelyn attributed it to reduced stress. The cardiologist attributed it to the adjusted medication protocol. Elena suspected it was both and also possibly the 45-minute afternoon teas. Adrian was at the back of the room. She had known he would be there, and she had known he would stand at the back because she had spent a year learning the specific grammar of how he showed up for things that mattered to him present, fully, and in the position that made the most room for whoever else needed the front. She looked at her notes. She had written a speech. It was a good speech. She knew it was good because she had read it to Maya twice, and Maya had cried both times, and Maya's crying was a reliable quality indicator. She set the notes aside. She did not need them. She said, "I was invisible for a long time. I was invisible because I was scared, and because being invisible was the safest way I knew to get through rooms where I had no power. I was invisible because the people around me were comfortable with me being invisible, and comfort is a very effective system for maintaining the status quo." She paused, and then I saw something, and I moved. Not because I was brave, because I recognized that another person's life mattered, and that recognition was louder than the fear. The room was completely quiet. What I didn't know, standing in that ballroom a year ago, was that moving was going to change everything. Not just for one family, not just for one operation, for me. Because the moment you step out of the space that was assigned to you and act from what you actually know and who you actually are, the assigned space cannot hold you anymore. And you discover that it was never as fixed as it looked. She looked at the room. At Maya in the front row, hands folded in her lap, eyes bright. At Evelyn, who was watching with the expression she used when she was proud and did not want to make it obvious. At 300 people who were here because they had heard about a woman who had been invisible in a powerful house and had turned that invisibility into something that could not be contained. She said, "Every person in this room who has ever been overlooked, who has ever been made to feel that their presence was incidental, that their labor was interchangeable, that their safety was a cost of doing business, you were never invisible. You were simply in a room full of people who needed you not to be seen. That is their limitation, not yours." She paused. The poisoned ring was meant to end one life. It exposed a betrayal, stopped a war, and started this. Every single person helped by the initiative this year, the 43 workers who received legal support, the 18 who accessed the education grants, the 7 who used the confidential reporting system and were not retaliated against because we were watching. They are. What happens when one overlooked person decides that being seen is worth the risk? She stepped back from the podium. The room did not erupt immediately. There was a single beat of silence, the kind that happens when something true has been said, and the room needs one moment to let it settle. And then it came, full and warm and sustained. Maya was on her feet first. Of course she was. Elena stepped down from the platform and moved through the room, accepting the hands and the words and the specific weight of being acknowledged in a place that had once made her invisible. And she did it without deflecting or minimizing or performing the careful smallness that had been her survival strategy for so long. She let herself be seen. She was still learning how, and she made it slightly awkward in places, and she was fine with that. Near the back of the room, she found Adrian standing against the wall with his arms folded, and his expression doing the thing it did when he was feeling something he considered too large for a crowded room. Contained, careful, but visible underneath if you knew what to look for. She knew what to look for. Good speech, he said. It was a great speech, she said. Don't undersell it. The corner of his mouth moved. The precursor to a smile that she had learned was, in its way, the fullest version of one he had. It was a great speech, thank you. He looked at her for a moment. How does it feel? She thought about the question. She thought about the supply cart in the East Corridor, and the service entrance, and the notebook in the apron pocket, and the 12-minute mornings with cheap coffee before the day became noise. She thought about the debt that had been collected against her, and the overtime that had been stolen, and the 3 years of being walked through and looked past and relied upon, and entirely unseen. She thought about the moment she had dropped the tray and moved. It feels like the beginning, she said. Not the end. The beginning. He nodded. The slow way he nodded when something landed exactly right. Then he said, I have something for you. He reached into his jacket and produced a small envelope. From Evelyn. She asked me to give it to you tonight. Elena opened it. Inside was a card, handwritten in Evelyn's precise, slightly old-fashioned script. It said, you reminded an old family what it meant to have integrity. You reminded my son what it meant to lead. And you reminded me that the most important people in any room are usually the ones nobody thought to notice. I am very glad nobody noticed you, my dear, until you decided they would. With love, Elena held the card for a moment. She did not cry, because she had cried her 4 minutes at the kitchen table, and she was fresh out for this particular occasion, but it was close. Tell her, she stopped. I'll tell her myself. She crossed the room to where Evelyn was sitting, and she sat beside her, and they talked the way they had been talking for a year now. Directly, honestly, without performing anything for anyone while the gala moved around them. At the end of the evening, as the guests were leaving and the room was beginning the particular process of becoming itself again. After an event, Elena stood at the edge of the ballroom and looked at the space where, 1 year ago, she had dropped a tray and changed everything. The floor was the same floor. The room was the same room. She was not the same person, except that she was entirely the same person, the same woman who had always been watching, always been thinking, always been more than the role she had been assigned. She had simply stopped pretending otherwise. The overlooked maid did not become important because a powerful man noticed her. She became impossible to overlook because she chose to stop making herself small in rooms that depended on her smallness to function. She had stepped into danger when everyone else looked away. She had told the truth when keeping it would have been easier. She had built something real from the specific wreckage of a system that had tried to use her up and leave her invisible. And standing in that ballroom with Maya's laugh somewhere behind her and Evelyn's card in her hand and a future that was entirely, completely, irreversibly, her own Elena Brooks understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had earned every inch of the ground she stood on, that she had never needed anyone's permission to take up space. She had simply needed to stop waiting for it. Elena stood at the edge of the Hawthorne ballroom after the last guest had gone, and she thought about love. Not the version she had grown up with. Not the version in the movies her mother used to watch on Sunday afternoons, before everything fell apart, the version where love arrives like weather, sudden and total, and rearranges a person's life around itself, without asking permission. Not the version that had been sold to her generation as the thing that completes you, that finds you, that rescues you from the ordinary difficulty of being alive. She thought about the real version, the one she had spent the last year living inside of, close enough to understand its actual texture. She was 25 years old. She had been poisoned at a party. She had identified a conspiracy from a hospital bed. She had walked back into a house that had underpaid her for 3 years and used what she knew to dismantle a betrayal that had been 30 years in the making. She had started an organization, enrolled in college, and negotiated the terms of her own future with the precision of someone who had learned, the hard way, that the terms matter as much as the outcome. And somewhere inside all of that, she had fallen in love. Slowly, imperfectly. without losing herself in the process. That last part, she understood now, was the part nobody talked about enough. Evelyn found her there, standing at the edge of the empty ballroom, which was exactly the kind of thing Evelyn did appeared, at the precise moment when someone needed to not be alone with their thoughts, without being asked. "You're still here," Evelyn said. "I was thinking," Elena said. "About love." She said it without embarrassment, because Evelyn was the kind of person you could say true things to without having to dress them up, about what it actually is, versus what everyone says it is. Evelyn settled into the chair nearest to her, the one she had been helped to by her daughter-in-law at the event, the one positioned for easy access, which Elena had placed there deliberately, which Evelyn had noticed and not mentioned. She folded her hands in her lap with the particular composure of a woman who has arrived at a conversation she was already prepared for. "Tell me what you've concluded," Evelyn said. Elena looked at the ballroom floor, at the place where, 1 year ago, she had dropped a tray. "I think love is mostly a decision," she said, "not the feeling. The feeling is real, but the feeling is not the thing. The feeling is what gets your attention. The decision is what builds the actual structure." She paused. "And I think most people confuse the two, and that's why so much of it collapses. Because feelings change. Feelings respond to circumstance. Feelings are the most honest thing in the world, and also the most unreliable, because they are always telling you the truth about right now, which is not the same as telling you the truth about what something will." Evelyn was quiet, listening. "What I felt in that hospital room was not love," Elena continued. "What I felt was clarity. And what I felt for the first month after, working through everything with Adrian, was something closer to respect than love. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of someone being actually different from what you expected, and deciding that the difference mattered." She paused. "Love came later, quietly, without announcing itself. And when I recognized it, what surprised me was that it did not feel like completion. It felt like addition, like something being added to a life that was already its own thing, rather than something arriving to finish an incomplete one." Evelyn said very quietly, "Yes." Elena looked at her. "You know this. I have known it for 40 years, Evelyn said. "I married a complicated man, a man who was capable of great loyalty and great blindness simultaneously. A man who built something that had real worth in it and real damage in it, sometimes in the same decision. I loved him fully, and I was never under any illusion that loving him fully required me to pretend the damage was not there." She paused. "That was the thing I had to figure out for myself, because nobody told me. That love is not the same as approval. That you can love someone and still see them clearly. That seeing them clearly is in fact the most genuine form the love can take." Elena absorbed this. "Did he know that you saw him clearly?" "Toward the end, yes. I think in the beginning it unsettled him. Men of that generation, in that world, were not accustomed to being truly seen by their wives. They were accustomed to being supported, to being reflected back at themselves in a form that was slightly more flattering than reality." Evelyn's expression was warm and dry simultaneously, in the specific way of a woman who has made peace with a complicated truth. It took years for him to understand that being seen clearly by someone who loves you anyway is the greatest gift available to a human being. Not being seen as perfect, Elena said. Never that. Being seen as real. Completely real. Flaws and damage and potential and all of it, and loved as that real thing, not as the performance of it. Evelyn looked at her. "That is what you are offering my son, whether you have named it that or not." Elena thought about this. She thought about the conversation in the East Corridor where she had told Adrian that she trusted him to be working toward becoming someone who would not interfere, rather than trusting him as a completed fact. She thought about the handshake that had almost become laughter. She thought about the month of slow, deliberate conversations where she had watched him make choices that cost him and make them anyway. And the specific feeling that produced in her not gratitude, not admiration exactly, but something more intimate than either. The feeling of witnessing someone do the real work of changing and understanding that you are the only person in the room who fully sees what that work costs. "I see him clearly," Elena said. "He is not finished. He is going to make mistakes with the organization transition. He is going to revert to old patterns sometimes, especially under pressure, and then he is going to catch himself and feel genuinely bad about it. And I am going to have to decide in each of those moments whether the catching himself counts as much as the reverting." She paused. "And I think it does. I think the catching yourself is actually the thing, because nobody stops reverting. People just get faster at catching it." "That is a very mature understanding for someone who is 25, Evelyn said. "I have had an accelerated education," Elena said dryly. Evelyn laughed, the real laugh, the chest laugh. She said, "You have." They were quiet for a moment. The ballroom was completely empty now except for the two of them and the ordinary sounds of a large house after an event. Then Elena said something she had not planned to say. It came up the way real things come up, not staged, not prepared, just arriving because the conditions were right and the person across from her was safe enough to say it to. "I was afraid," she said, "that if I let myself love him, I would lose the parts of myself that I had worked the hardest to keep. The independence, the clarity, the way I see things without needing someone else to confirm what I see." She looked at Evelyn. I had watched love do that to people. Make them smaller. Make them adjust themselves into whatever shape the other person needed until the original shape was gone and they couldn't even remember what it looked like. "Yes," Evelyn said, "that happens, and I decided, somewhere in the middle of all of this, that the test of whether this particular love was something real was whether it made me larger or smaller, whether it added to what I was or started subtracting from it." She paused. "And what I found was that it made me larger. Not because Adrian was doing something right, exactly, although he was trying, but because the experience of being loved by someone who was genuinely trying to see me clearly, who was asking instead of telling, who was accepting being told no and responding to it by coming back better rather than smaller, that experience made me believe more fully in my own size, in my own right to take up space." Evelyn looked at her for a long time. Her eyes were very clear. "Elena," she said, "that is what love is supposed to do." And there it was. The thing Elena had been circling for a year, the thing she had been building toward in every conversation and every decision, in every carefully negotiated boundary, in every moment of choosing herself, while also choosing to let someone in. The thing she had needed to say out loud to understand it fully. Love that makes you smaller is not love. It is a transaction wearing love's clothing. It is the exchange of your authentic self for the security of being chosen, which is a trade that feels like safety and functions like a slow disappearance. Love that makes you larger, love that sees you clearly and wants the full and complicated truth of you, that grows in proportion to your honesty rather than shrinking from it, that gives you room to be wrong and be right and change your mind and hold your ground. That is the real thing. That is the thing worth building toward. Elena had spent 24 years of her life making herself invisible. She had done it to survive, and she had done it well, and she did not regret it because it had kept her and Maya alive and moving forward when there was no other available strategy. But surviving and living are not the same thing. And invisibility, which had once been her sharpest tool, was not something she was willing to keep as her permanent condition. She had stepped into danger when everyone else looked away. That had been the first act of making herself visible not for anyone else, but for herself. The first acknowledgement that her presence in the world was real enough to matter, that her body standing between a poisoned ring and an old woman's heart was a body that counted. And everything that followed, the hospital, the audit, the canceled debt, the evidence, the initiative, the school application, the 43 workers, and the 18 grants, and the 7 reports, all of it had been an extension of that first moment. The moment she had decided that being invisible was a skill and not a sentence. The moment she had understood that the world does not get to decide your size. You decide your size, and then you live at that size, consistently and without apology, until the rooms around you rearrange themselves to accommodate the truth of what you are. Adrian found them there eventually. He came into the ballroom from the main entrance, the same entrance Elena used now, every time, and he crossed the room without hurrying, the way he moved when he was not managing anything, when he was just a person going towards something he wanted to be near. He looked at Evelyn. "Am I interrupting?" he said. "We were talking about love," Evelyn said pleasantly. Adrian looked at Elena with the specific expressions he used when he was not entirely sure what he was walking into, but had decided that honesty was the only viable strategy. "Should I be?" Elena said. "Sit down." He sat. And the three of them sat together in the empty ballroom of the Hawthorne estate. The old woman who had mentored a maid into a force of change, the crime boss who had chosen accountability over power, and the woman who had walked into a ballroom invisible and walked out of it impossible to overlook. And they talked until the room was fully dark, and the city outside was doing what cities do at midnight, which is to say it was alive and loud and completely indifferent to the particular love story being conducted in this particular room. At some point, Adrian reached over and took Elena's hand. He did not make a production of it. He just took her hand the way you take someone's hand when you have decided that you are not going to keep pretending you don't want to. And Elena let him, the way you let someone in when you have decided that the door you have been keeping locked is not protecting you anymore. It is just keeping you alone. The next morning, Elena was at her kitchen table at 5:30 with her coffee. She had a paper due in 2 weeks and a board meeting for the initiative on Thursday and a call with her attorney about the initiative's second-year funding structure. She had Maya's voice memo saved in her phone, the one with just her name in it, that she replayed sometimes when she needed to remember that the people who love you are paying attention even when you forget that they are. She opened her laptop. She started working. She was not invisible. She had never been invisible. She had simply been in rooms that needed her not to be seen. And she had accommodated that need long enough to survive it. And then she had stopped. And the room had changed. Not because she had forced it, but because the truth of what she was had simply become too clear and too present to be looked past anymore. That was the whole of it. That was the story in its simplest form, stripped of the poison and the conspiracy and the sealed rooms and the evidence and all the machinery of plot. A woman who understood her own worth, held it intact through years of being required not to, and then stood up in one moment and let it be fully visible. And in doing so, changed everything she touched. That is what courage looks like from the inside. Not the absence of fear, not the dramatic gesture, just the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you are real, and that real things deserve to take up space, and that the world, however reluctantly, however slowly, will eventually have to agree. Elena Brooks had always known this. She had simply been waiting for the moment to prove it. The moment had come, and she had been ready.